The Galactic Empire was vast and unyielding, a sprawling authority that stretched across the stars. Its rule was absolute, maintained through a mixture of technological superiority and a reputation for ruthless conquest. For centuries, countless species had either been absorbed into its fold or crushed under its heel. Among the many subdued civilizations, humanity was a relatively recent addition, its small blue planet quickly overwhelmed by the Empire's overwhelming might. The Empire's leaders scarcely gave humans a second thought after their conquest. They saw them as fragile beings, short-lived, physically unimposing, and wholly unremarkable. While some species in the galaxy had resisted integration for decades, fighting tooth and claw, humanity had capitulated after a mere few years of conflict. To the Empire, Earth's submission was proof of humanity's lack of resolve. A race of diplomats and traders, they often said, but not warriors. This perception had calcified over the years. Humans were allowed to participate in certain parts of the Empire's administration, handling bureaucratic tasks and minor trade negotiations. When it came to matters of war, however, they were excluded entirely. No human had ever been granted command over a starship, let alone an army. It wasn't just that humans were deemed unqualified. The Empire genuinely believed they were too afraid to handle the brutal realities of war. Alien officers spoke of humanity with a mixture of condescension and amusement. Stories circulated in the barracks about how humans would surrender en masse at the first sign of danger. "They'll beg for peace before a shot is fired," one general joked during a strategy meeting. The sentiment was shared across the ranks. Humans avoided war not out of wisdom or strategy but because they lacked the stomach for it. The tipping point came during a routine council meeting on a neutral world. A human diplomat, dressed in the unassuming formal attire typical of his kind, sat quietly among representatives from other species. The meeting was mundane, covering trade agreements and border disputes. But as discussions turned to the topic of military contributions, an imperial officer couldn't resist making a comment. "Humans," the officer said with a sneer, his tone dripping with disdain, "have nothing to offer us on the battlefield. They cower behind treaties and compromises. Why should we waste resources arming those who can't even defend themselves?" The remark drew scattered laughter from the assembly, but the human diplomat remained composed. He adjusted his glasses and replied calmly, "We have never claimed to be conquerors, nor do we aspire to be. But do not mistake patience for weakness." The officer smirked. "Is that so? Then prove it. Send your people to the next war games. Let us see if humanity is anything more than a race of cowards." The room fell silent. The challenge hung in the air, and every eye turned to the human representative. The diplomat nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "We accept." Word of the decision spread quickly throughout the Empire, sparking a wave of mockery. The idea of humans participating in military exercises was laughable to most. Even the Empire's weakest vassal species had proven themselves in combat simulations before. Humans, by contrast, had no record of success in warfare. Among the alien elite, it was widely assumed the humans would fail spectacularly, further cementing their reputation as timid pacifists. But among humanity there was a different sentiment brewing. While many were skeptical of the decision to participate, a select group saw the challenge as an opportunity. These were men and women who had studied humanity's long and often bloody history, individuals who understood that Earth's past was filled with wars, revolutions, and conflicts that had forged a uniquely resilient spirit. And leading the charge was a contingent of Americans, a group whose reputation on Earth had long been synonymous with determination and resourcefulness. When the official roster was announced, alien observers noted with bemusement the heavy American presence in the human forces. "Why so many from one region?" an alien journalist asked during a press conference. The human spokesperson replied simply, "They volunteered." The Empire assigned the humans to a relatively minor exercise, pairing them against a species known for its speed and agility but lacking in heavy firepower. It was meant to be a formality, a chance for the humans to learn their place without causing too much embarrassment. Imperial officers watched from the observation deck, their expressions ranging from bored to mildly amused. To everyone else, it seemed like a foregone conclusion. To the humans it was something else entirely. The Americans who arrived to represent humanity were a curious sight to the Empire. They moved with a quiet, almost unsettling confidence, carrying themselves not with the deference expected of their kind, but with the assuredness of those who knew exactly what they were capable of. It was as if they had no doubt in their minds that this would be their arena to dominate. The Empire's officers, who had watched countless species attempt to challenge their might, dismissed the humans' cocky demeanor as naive bravado. The human contingent, primarily made up of seasoned soldiers from Earth's military elite, wasted no time in their preparations. They spoke little, choosing instead to analyze every detail of the environment they would be fighting in. Alien commanders and strategists, already confident in their superiority, sneered at what they perceived as human paranoia. To them, it was laughable that the humans seemed to be taking the exercise so seriously. The aliens assumed that humans incapable of handling real combat would be easily overwhelmed by the scale and intensity of the simulation. As the Americans set up, they appeared calm, almost unnervingly so. They studied the alien terrain, examining everything from the landscape's subtle nuances to the resources they could exploit. Some of the American soldiers took note of the alien communication systems and power structures, but they did so in a way that suggested this exercise wasn't a test of military prowess. For them, it was a chance to demonstrate something far more dangerous: their creativity. "Everything's a weapon," one of the American commanders said, his voice low and steady as he surveyed the simulation zone. "We just have to know how to use it." His words were matter-of-fact, as if the very concept of defeat wasn't a possibility. Meanwhile, the Empire continued to underestimate them. The alien generals were puzzled by the lack of traditional tactics. Where they expected humans to prepare for direct assault strategies, they saw nothing but strange, unconventional approaches. The Americans seemed less concerned with fighting the enemy and more focused on exploiting every advantage available to them, whether it was terrain, psychological manipulation, or simple misdirection. The Empire's commanders believed they could easily exploit these human missteps. They assumed that the simulation would follow the same patterns as other species' attempts to challenge the Empire: bold but ultimately predictable. The aliens had every intention of making the war games a quick and humiliating experience for the humans. But the Americans weren't making mistakes. They were planning, patiently and meticulously, as if they had already seen the outcome. On the eve of the exercise, a quiet tension hung over the humans. But it was not the tension of fear or doubt. It was the focus of a people who had prepared for every possibility. They knew exactly what they were up against and they were ready for it. The American commanders gathered their troops, giving them final instructions. There was no bravado in their words, only the cold precision of those who understood exactly what needed to be done. One commander gave a brief nod before sending them off. "We're here to win," he said. "No matter what it takes." His words didn't carry the weight of a rallying cry. They were simple, clear, and devoid of emotion. The Empire's forces, however, were oblivious. They watched the humans from the sidelines, convinced that these cowards would falter when faced with real combat. They couldn't see the quiet confidence behind the human soldiers' eyes, nor the glint of calculation that hinted at something far more dangerous than mere survival instincts. When the war games finally began, the Americans moved with a deliberate calm, each action seemingly small and insignificant, yet building toward something larger. They moved swiftly but not recklessly, avoiding direct confrontation with the aliens whenever possible, instead relying on subtlety. The alien forces, anticipating an attack, were baffled by the lack of direct engagement. Instead of a fight, they found themselves confronted by a series of traps, miscommunications, and unexpected ambushes. They found their supply lines cut off, their communications jammed, and their reconnaissance units picked off one by unseen assailants. Every step they took seemed to lead them into a carefully laid snare. The Empire's soldiers, long accustomed to being the hunters, now found themselves in the role of prey. The American forces, who had never engaged directly in the kind of warfare the Empire was used to, were instead playing a game of patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The alien leaders, watching from their high vantage points, couldn't make sense of what was happening. The humans had not attacked, they had simply disappeared into the landscape, leaving only subtle signs that they had been there. The more the Empire's forces advanced, the more they found themselves isolated and confused. They grew increasingly paranoid, unsure of where the next threat would come from. It was a slow, grinding realization that the humans had turned the tables on them, not with sheer force but with something far more insidious: the ability to manipulate the environment, control the narrative, and force the enemy to play by their rules. A single alien general, watching as one of his best units fell into a perfectly timed trap, muttered to himself, "What are they doing?" It wasn't until the first major engagement occurred, when the Americans launched their first coordinated assault, that the Empire's commanders began to understand the true nature of the human threat. By then, however, it was too late. The Americans had already established control over critical areas, and their forces were rapidly outpacing the Empire's response time. It was a masterclass in warfare not based on brute strength, but on strategic cunning, manipulation, and precision. What the Empire had initially dismissed as an overestimation of their abilities was rapidly becoming a nightmare. The Americans were not just surviving, they were thriving, using the Empire's own tactics against them. Every move made by the human forces seemed deliberate, like they were playing an entirely different game that no one had been prepared for. The alien generals exchanged anxious glances. They had grossly misjudged humanity. These were not the weak, terrified beings they had assumed. These were soldiers, ruthless, inventive, and willing to do whatever it took to win. And as the first round of engagements concluded, one thing was clear: the Empire had made a grave mistake. It wasn't about fighting. It wasn't about winning in the conventional sense. The Americans were showing the galaxy what it meant to wage war on their terms. And the Empire was slowly coming to realize just how dangerous that could be. As the war games progressed, the full scope of what the Americans were capable of became glaringly apparent. The Empire's confidence was beginning to crack. Where once there had been certainty that humanity was nothing more than an easy target, now there was doubt. The alien forces were confused and frustrated by the relentless, unpredictable tactics the Americans used. They weren't fighting a traditional war, they were playing a completely different game. The first major clash occurred when the Americans, having drawn the alien forces into a carefully constructed trap, launched their assault. It was nothing like the Empire expected. The humans did not storm the enemy's position with overwhelming firepower. Instead, they struck with deadly precision, using a combination of ambushes and psychological warfare to create confusion and panic within the alien ranks. The alien forces, once proud and sure of their superiority, found themselves on the defensive. The battle unfolded with a brutal rhythm. The Americans employed guerrilla tactics, leveraging the terrain to their advantage. They struck when and where the Empire least expected, using hit-and-run tactics that left the aliens constantly on edge. The Empire's forces, overwhelmed by the constant pressure and disorientation, began to fracture. They couldn't keep up with the pace of the conflict. The Americans had turned their own terrain into a weapon. To the alien commanders, it felt as though the humans were everywhere at once. They used the environment to their advantage, turning every corner and crevice into a potential ambush. Where the Empire's forces were accustomed to overwhelming firepower, the Americans employed misdirection, subtlety, and a relentless, unyielding pressure that wore their opponents down. The alien commanders tried to regroup, but every time they did, the Americans were already striking somewhere else, creating chaos and confusion in their wake. What shocked the Empire's forces the most wasn't just the Americans' ability to fight. It was their willingness to sacrifice in order to win. The American commanders had made a chilling decision early on. Nothing was off the table. If it meant exploiting weaknesses, they were prepared to do whatever it took to gain the upper hand. The human soldiers, with a cold calculation, executed every strategy without hesitation. They didn't fight for honor or glory, they fought to win no matter the cost. The Empire, with its strict codes of conduct and honorable warfare, was utterly unprepared for this kind of ruthlessness. The first major alien stronghold fell within a matter of hours, its defenses crippled by a coordinated series of strikes. The humans didn't wait for a proper engagement. They attacked, overwhelming the enemy forces with superior tactics and relentless assaults. The Empire's forces had underestimated the Americans' ability to adapt and respond to shifting conditions. The human soldiers were quick on their feet, unpredictable, and relentless in ways the Empire had never anticipated. As the battle raged on, the Empire's officers began to notice something else. The Americans seemed to be orchestrating a larger psychological game. They had manipulated the flow of the conflict, baiting the aliens into believing they were winning only to shift tactics at the last possible moment. The alien generals struggled to understand what was happening. They had never seen a species that could adapt so quickly, learn from each encounter, and exploit weaknesses with such efficiency. It wasn't just that the Americans were good at warfare, it was that they were masters of strategy, capable of turning the tide of battle in an instant. They had an uncanny ability to read the battlefield, identifying opportunities and weaknesses faster than any of the Empire's generals could. What began as a simple exercise had turned into a nightmare for the Empire. The human forces had gone from being the underdogs to the clear victors. Despite their best efforts, the Empire couldn't regain control of the situation. The humans had disrupted their communications, sabotaged their supply lines, and made it impossible for the Empire's forces to regroup. Every time they tried to mount a counteroffensive, the Americans responded with a more effective tactic. The aliens, used to dominating their foes with sheer force, were being outsmarted at every turn. The more the Empire's forces tried to adapt, the more they fell into the trap the Americans had set. It was then that the final blow came. The Americans launched their final assault, a swift, brutal push that wiped out the remaining resistance. It wasn't a direct charge. It wasn't about overwhelming the enemy with firepower. The Americans had learned everything they needed to know about the enemy's weaknesses, and they exploited them with terrifying efficiency. The final battle was swift, ruthless, and decisive. The Empire's forces, scattered and demoralized, fell quickly. The humans had achieved complete victory. In the aftermath, the alien generals gathered in shock. They had been so certain of their superiority. They had expected the humans to falter, to crumble under the pressure of combat. Instead, the Americans had proven to be not just effective soldiers, but ruthless tacticians. The Empire had underestimated humanity at every turn, and now they were paying the price. The Americans stood victorious, but there was no celebration. There was no time for pride or satisfaction. They had come to win, and when they did, the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. The ruthless efficiency of the American forces had shattered the Empire's belief that humans were nothing more than weak, cowardly diplomats. The war games had become a demonstration of humanity's true nature, capable of surviving, adapting, and winning against all odds. And as the final alien forces were driven from the battlefield, the Empire's high command was forced to confront the reality that humanity was no longer the timid, fragile species they had once believed them to be. The Americans had shown the galaxy what true warfare looked like. They had proven that when pushed to the limit, humanity would stop at nothing to win. The Empire's perception of humanity had been irrevocably shattered, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The fallout from the war games was swift and irreversible. The Empire, once confident in its dominance, now found itself grappling with the consequences of its underestimation of humanity. The alien generals, who had assumed that human soldiers would crumble under pressure, now faced the harsh reality. The Americans had not only won, they had proven themselves to be far more capable than anyone had imagined. The defeat was nothing short of humiliating, and it echoed through the highest echelons of the Empire's leadership. In the wake of the exercise, the Empire issued a public statement, attempting to downplay the loss. They claimed that the war games had been nothing more than a demonstration, that the human success was irrelevant in the grand scope of the galaxy's power dynamics. But even as they made these claims, whispers began to spread. The truth of what had happened could not be hidden. The humans had fought with an ingenuity and ruthlessness that no one had expected. Back on Earth, the response was one of pride and disbelief. The victory had been swift, overwhelming, and absolute. The Americans had shown the galaxy that they were not the weak, afraid species the Empire had assumed. In fact, they had demonstrated a terrifying level of competence in combat, one that would likely change the trajectory of humanity's future in the galaxy. While Earth's governments took a moment to savor the victory, those who had been involved in the conflict understood that this was just the beginning. The Empire would not take this loss lightly. They would come back, and they would come back with a vengeance. Despite the victory, the Americans were not naive. They knew that the war games were only a small battle in a much larger war. The Empire had been humiliated, but their thirst for power had not been quenched. The galaxy's greatest military force had suffered a deep blow to its pride, and it was only a matter of time before they would retaliate. Yet, for the first time in history, the Empire found itself hesitant. The public outcry from within their ranks was palpable. The leaders who had once scoffed at humanity's strength now found themselves at odds with one another. Some argued for swift retribution. After all, humanity had dared to challenge the Empire and win. Others, however, saw the defeat as a wake-up call. For the first time, the galaxy's mightiest force was questioning its invulnerability. The once unshakable Empire was now vulnerable in ways it had never been before. The humans had done more than simply defeat the Empire's forces. They had planted a seed of doubt that would grow throughout the galaxy. No longer would species cower at the mere mention of the Empire's name. The balance of power had shifted, and the Empire had been forced to confront the possibility that it was no longer the galaxy's uncontested ruler. In the days following the war games, the Americans were left with a bittersweet victory. There was no great celebration, no massive parades. Instead, the atmosphere was somber, reflective. They had proven themselves, but they knew that the true challenge had yet to come. The Empire would regroup, and when they did, they would come back stronger, angrier, and more determined than ever to crush humanity's newfound pride. The humans had not yet felt the full weight of the Empire's wrath. However, the consequences of the war games had rippled through the galaxy in ways the Empire hadn't anticipated. Other species, previously subjugated or dominated by the Empire, had witnessed humanity's rise. They had seen the humans defy expectations, fight with a ferocity unmatched by any other species in the galaxy, and emerge victorious. For the first time, the galaxy's lesser races began to see humans not as weaklings, but as potential allies, as equals who could be trusted in battle. On many worlds, the message was clear. If humans could stand up to the Empire and win, perhaps it was time for others to do the same. Across the galaxy, whispers of rebellion and resistance began to grow. It was a quiet movement at first, but it was gaining strength. The Empire had taken humanity for granted, and now, those who had suffered under its rule saw the humans not as outsiders but as a beacon of hope. The shift in sentiment was undeniable. Former slaves, conquered civilizations, and vassal species now looked to humanity as a symbol of strength. They realized that the Empire's seemingly unassailable dominance had been shattered, and the first crack in the Empire's armor had been made by the humans. It was a moment of reckoning for the galaxy. As for the humans, their position in the galaxy had changed forever. No longer were they seen as mere pawns or passive participants in the Empire's grand design. They had earned their place among the stars, and their reputation as fierce, cunning warriors would follow them wherever they went. The war games had shown the galaxy that humanity, underestimating them, was a fatal mistake. Now, every species would think twice before considering them weak or inferior. While the Empire licked its wounds and tried to reassert its dominance, the humans were already planning for the future. They knew that the Empire would eventually strike back, but they also knew that they had already taken the first step in shifting the galaxy's power dynamics. Humanity had not only won the war games, they had ignited a revolution. Whether the Empire recognized it or not, they had been forced to acknowledge that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. In the years that followed, the galaxy would change. The once mighty Empire, shaken by its defeat, would be forced to reckon with a new reality. The humans had set a precedent. They would no longer be mere spectators in the galactic stage. The war games had proven one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt. Humanity was capable of anything. And in the end, the greatest lesson learned by both the Empire and the galaxy was this: never underestimate the strength, will, and resolve of those who have nothing left to lose. The ruthless Americans had demonstrated that, and in doing so, they had ensured that humanity's place in the galaxy was secure, whether the Empire liked it or not.